You need to watch this if you crave chills down your spine. Welcome to Soul Studios. Here, true crime meets the unknown. Suspense lurks in every shadow, and supernatural forces whisper from the dark. We craft chilling, edge-of-your-seat short stories inspired by the eerie, the unexplained, and the most haunting mysteries. 3 new stories drop every week, each one darker than the last. Are you ready to step inside? Subscribe now before the next story finds you.
In the quiet town of Ashcroft, Maine, a man vanishes without a trace from a locked farmhouse in the dead of night. No footprints, no forced entry, just a blood-chilling scream and a trail of impossible clues. What begins as a missing person case spirals into one of the most baffling, unsolved mysteries the town has ever faced. As investigators uncover unsettling details and the community struggles to understand, the question remains: how can someone disappear from behind a locked door? And why? If you love bone-chilling mysteries that blur the line between the possible and the paranormal, hit that subscribe button. More stories like this are waiting, some true, some twisted, all unforgettable. Turn on notifications because the next story might just keep you up at night. It was just after 3 a.m. on a cold October night in 2013 when 2 police officers in the quiet town of Ashcroft, Maine, battered down the door of an old farmhouse. They were responding to a panicked call from a neighbor who had heard a blood-chilling scream cut through the darkness. The front door was secured with a heavy chain from the inside, and every window was latched. By all accounts, no one should have been able to get in or out. The officers expected to find a victim or somebody inside. Instead, they found an empty room and a mystery that would haunt their town for years to come. Ashcroft was the kind of small, woodsy New England town where everyone knew everyone, and nothing much ever happened. Nestled among rolling hills and maple trees, it hadn't seen a serious crime in decades. That's why the vanishing at the old Harper farmhouse sent shockwaves through the community. The house, a modest 1-story structure on the edge of town, was being rented by a 32-year-old handyman named Mark Hansen. Mark was a familiar face around Ashcroft, quiet, reliable, and well-liked by his neighbours. He had moved in 6 months earlier, drawn by the promise of steady work and the town's peaceful charm. Nobody could have imagined that his home would become the centre of an impossible crime scene. On the evening of October 12th, Mark's day had been entirely unremarkable. He grabbed dinner at the local diner around 6 p.m., trading pleasantries with the waitress who knew his regular order. Afterward, he stopped by a convenience store for a pack of batteries and a loaf of bread, captured on the store's CCTV smiling politely at the cashier. A neighbour, Judith Crane, saw Mark arrive home around 7:30 p.m. He waved to her from his front porch before retreating inside for the night. By all appearances, Mark Hansen was settling in for a quiet evening at home, a routine end to an ordinary day. That ordinary day turned into a night of confusion and terror in the early morning hours. Sometime around 2:45 a.m., Judith was jolted awake by a short, sharp scream echoing across the dark. She sat up in bed, heart pounding, straining to listen. The scream, Mark's voice, she thought, had cut off as suddenly as it began. In the tense silence that followed, Judith felt a prickling sense that something was very wrong. Gathering her courage, she dialed 911 and reported that her neighbour might be in trouble. Within 15 minutes, 2 sheriff's deputies arrived and found Mark's single-story home locked tight. Lights were on inside, but no one responded to knocking or shouts. Fearing the worst, the officers broke the door open and stepped into a nightmare of puzzling clues. Inside, the living room looked as if a struggle had taken place. A lamp had been knocked over, its bulb flickering on the hardwood floor. A chair was toppled on its side. On the coffee table lay an open book and a half-finished mug of tea, as if Mark had been interrupted mid-sip. Most disturbing of all, a few drops of blood were spattered across the floorboards near the hallway doorway, bright red against the worn oak. The officers moved carefully through each room of the small house, announcing themselves, guns drawn, unsure what they might find. They cleared the bedroom, the kitchen, the tiny bathroom. No sign of Mark. No sign of anyone. Yet every door and window was secured from the inside. The front door had been latched with its chain. The only other exit, a back door leading to the kitchen garden, was deadbolted. All the windows were closed and locked, some even painted shut by age. It was as if Mark had simply vanished into thin air while inside a sealed chamber. The police radioed for backup, and within hours a full investigation was underway at the farmhouse. Detectives and crime scene technicians arrived before dawn, baffled and intrigued in equal measure. An extensive search of the property and surrounding yard turned up no footprints in the dew-covered grass, no tire tracks on the long gravel driveway, no signs of forced entry at all. Apart from the disarray inside and those few drops of blood, there was nothing to indicate what had happened to Mark Hansen. By midday, the story of the locked room disappearance had spread beyond Ashcroft. Local news vans parked at the end of the driveway, reporters jostling for a glimpse of the quiet house cordoned off by yellow police tape. Townspeople gathered in small clusters on porches and in the diner, exchanging rumours and nervous theories. How could a grown man go missing from behind a locked door? Some whispered that Mark might have staged his own disappearance, perhaps to escape a problem no one knew about. Others murmured darkly that he must have been attacked by someone or something already inside the house, hiding in wait. A few of the older residents, recalling local folklore, wondered in hushed tones if the old Harper farmhouse was cursed. After all, tragedy had struck there once before in the 1970s, a story about a prior owner's suicide that had long since morphed into ghostly lore. But a supernatural explanation was far from the official line. Investigators methodically pieced together a timeline. Mark was last definitely seen by anyone around 7:30 p.m. His phone records showed nothing out of the ordinary, no calls after 8 p.m, and his usual nightly alarm set for 6 a.m, which was still blaring when police entered, adding an eerie rhythm to the crime scene. Sometime in the night, something happened to cause Mark to scream, and likely caused the blood on the floor. Forensic teams noted that the blood drops led from the living room toward the hallway, but stopped abruptly, as if whoever was bleeding had paused or the bleeding was minimal. They also found Mark's cell phone under the couch, screen cracked. It appeared to have been stepped on. When technicians checked the phone, they discovered that it had dialed 911. The call was initiated but never connected beyond a few seconds. The dispatch log showed an incoming 911 call at 2:47 a.m. from Mark's number that had ended almost immediately. Perhaps Mark tried to call for help but was cut off before he could speak. This chilling detail suggested he had faced some kind of threat in those final moments. Despite a thorough search, two things were conspicuously missing from the scene: Mark's keys and his jacket. His wallet lay on the kitchen counter with cash and cards intact, and a pair of shoes sat by the door. But a canvas coat he normally hung on a peg was gone, and so were the keys to the house and to Mark's pickup truck. That truck, however, was still parked outside in its usual spot. It deepened the mystery. If Mark left, why hadn't he driven? And if someone took him, how did they lock up the house on the way out without the keys? The immediate thought was that Mark might have been forced out at gunpoint by an intruder who then secured the door. But locking that chain from outside was impossible without a trick or inside help. Investigators examined the chain latch closely and found a curious detail: a thin piece of clear fishing line caught on the metal loop of the chain. It looked like it had been cut or snapped. This suggested one possible method. Perhaps someone had threaded the line through the mail slot or a gap, hooked the chain and pulled it closed from outside, latching the door before yanking the line free. It was a classic magician's trick for a locked room illusion. The discovery of that fishing line was unsettling. It hinted that whoever orchestrated this had planned it meticulously. As the days passed with no sign of Mark, the police and the townspeople floated multiple theories, each more troubling than the last. Abduction. The leading theory initially was that an unknown assailant somehow entered the house, attacked Mark and then removed him, dead or alive, and cleverly locked the door on the way out. But the puzzle was how. Could there have been an accomplice still inside to latch the door, who then slipped out through a small window. Every window was checked, all were locked from inside, and the openings were too small for an adult. The house had no attic or crawl space that could serve as a secret passage. It just didn't add up. Voluntary disappearance. Some investigators considered whether Mark himself staged this scene to vanish deliberately. Perhaps he had a reason to run, debts, enemies, a desire to start over, and wanted it to look like he was taken. The fishing line mechanism could have been his doing, but that theory didn't sit well with those who knew Mark. He had just settled in Ashcroft, had steady work and friends. There were no signs of him planning a getaway. His bank accounts were untouched, and his personality was gentle, not prone to drama. Still, the cops couldn't ignore the possibility that Mark had pulled off a masterful hoax. Third-party cover-up. Another theory emerged that maybe Mark was killed in that house, and the murderer removed his body and rigged the locked room to confuse investigators. Under this scenario, Mark truly was the victim of foul play, and the missing body was evidence hidden by the killer. Perhaps someone with intimate knowledge of the house had orchestrated it. Suspicion briefly fell on the property's owner, an out-of-town landlord, but he had a solid alibi and no apparent motive. There were whispers about a recently released ex-convict who once lived in Ashcroft and might have held a grudge against Mark's family, but no evidence tied him to the scene. While these theories were debated, the police expanded their search. They combed the dense woods behind the farmhouse, drained a nearby pond, and even brought in cadaver dogs to sniff for any trace of Mark. Nothing was found. Not a drop of blood outside the house, not a torn piece of clothing, nothing. It was as if Mark had been swallowed by the night. Over the next few weeks, the investigation stalled, and the case began to go cold. Ashcroft's residents remained on edge. Many started locking their doors in broad daylight and installing extra bolts, as if an invisible intruder might slip in at any moment. Mark's close friends held a candlelight vigil on the town green, praying for answers. The county sheriff publicly assured everyone they were doing everything possible, but privately the detectives were at a loss. The locked room puzzle of Mark Hansen's disappearance seemed unsolvable. Then, about 2 months after Mark vanished, a shocking twist shattered the case wide open. The forensic lab results on the blood evidence finally came back, and it was not a match for Mark Hansen. The drops of blood found on the living room floor belonged to someone else entirely, an unidentified male. This was completely unexpected. Up until that point, everyone assumed the blood was Mark's, perhaps from an injury during an attack. If it wasn't Mark's blood, that meant a second person had been bleeding in that house. Investigators were stunned. Could it be that someone else was hurt or killed in that room? The police urgently ran the unknown DNA through national databases. Before long, they got a hit. The blood matched a man named Danny Kane, a drifter with a criminal record who had been spotted in Maine that fall. Danny Kane was a 40-year-old ex-con known for burglary, and he had no known connection to Mark Hansen or Ashcroft. According to a witness in a town 1 hour away, a man matching Danny's description was seen driving a rusty blue sedan toward Ashcroft on the afternoon of October 12th. That same car was found a week after Mark's disappearance, abandoned on a back road 20 miles from Ashcroft. Inside the car, investigators now discovered were faint bloodstains, later confirmed to be Danny's, and on the steering wheel, a single clear fingerprint identified as Mark Hansen's. This revelation turned the whole investigation upside down. The working theory flipped. Perhaps Mark wasn't the victim that night, he was the assailant. It appeared that Danny Kane might have come to Mark's house, possibly to rob him, and a violent confrontation ensued. Mark may have injured or even killed Danny in self-defense, explaining the blood and scream Judith heard, and then, for reasons unknown, Mark vanished. The evidence suggested Mark left the house alive, locking it behind him with that fishing line trick, and fled in Danny's blue sedan. But why would Mark run if he hadn't done anything wrong? Why not call the police after defending himself? The investigators could only speculate. Maybe Mark panicked, thinking no one would believe his story. Or maybe there was something darker in Mark's past, some secret that made him fear law enforcement. As the puzzle pieces rearranged, a chilling picture emerged. It now seemed likely that two men entered that locked house, and neither came out the front door in the normal way. One man's blood was left on the floor, and the other man's life was left in limbo. The authorities quietly issued a warrant for Mark Hansen's arrest, no longer as a missing person, but as a potential homicide suspect. They widened their search beyond Maine, alerting law enforcement nationwide to be on the lookout. But just as before, Mark had vanished without a trace. If he had indeed taken Danny's car, he'd switched vehicles or gone to ground by the time the car was found. There were unconfirmed sightings. A gas station attendant in Vermont swore he saw a man matching Mark's description traveling with a duffel bag, and a trucker in upstate New York reported picking up a hitchhiker who talked about heading west and oddly avoided giving his name. Each lead teased, then fizzled. Mark Hansen was nowhere to be found. Back in Ashcroft, the community struggled to reconcile this new theory with the man they thought they knew. Neighbors recalled Mark's kindness, fixing a porch step for an elderly couple, volunteering at the fall festival, and found it hard to imagine him harming someone unless he had to. Some of his friends firmly believed Mark must have felt threatened by this drifter and ran only out of fear. Others weren't so sure, quietly wondering if they ever really knew him at all. Old rumours resurfaced that Mark had moved to Ashcroft for a fresh start after some troubles elsewhere, though specifics never followed. The local police, for their part, scoured Mark's background and found minor run-ins with the law, an assault charge in his 20s that was dropped, a DUI. Nothing that screamed killer, but perhaps enough to make him worry the cops wouldn't see a self-defense killing as cut and dry. Winter set in, blanketing the Harper farmhouse in snow and silence. With no new leads, the official investigation eventually grinded to a halt. The case of Mark Hansen became the stuff of legend and caution in Ashcroft. Parents would double-check the locks at night and tell their children not to go out after dark. "Remember what happened to that fellow over on Harper Road," they'd whisper. The house itself sat vacant, owned by a bewildered landlord who couldn't even step inside without feeling unsettled. He eventually boarded up the windows and put it up for sale, but no buyers were eager to take on the place with such a dark story attached. Every so often, a curious amateur sleuth or a true crime blogger would roll into town, drawn by the allure of an unsolved mystery. They'd poke around the property's perimeter or chat up the townsfolk at the diner, but they never uncovered anything beyond what was already known. Mark Hansen's fate remained a giant question mark. Was he a victim running for his life, or a clever killer who managed to outsmart everyone? Without Mark's side of the story, the truth stayed frustratingly out of reach. As for Danny Kane, his fate was likewise a mystery. His body was never found. Some believed that Mark might have buried Danny somewhere in the dense wilderness or weighted him down in the river that snaked through the woods. Others thought Danny could have survived the altercation and slunk off, mortally wounded, to die alone far from the farmhouse, making Mark's panicked disappearance all the more tragic and unnecessary. But no evidence of Danny's whereabouts ever surfaced to confirm any scenario. To this day, the missing body in the locked room case of Ashcroft, Maine, remains unsolved. The Harper farmhouse, now permanently shut, stands as a grim monument to that night's events. Locals say that on quiet nights, when the wind rustles just right, you can still hear the clink of a loose chain hanging on the front door, swaying as if disturbed by an invisible hand. It's a small sound that sends a big shiver down the spine of anyone who remembers the story. It's as if the house itself refuses to forget that something impossible happened within its walls. In the end, the truth of what occurred in that locked room, why Mark Hansen screamed, what really became of Danny Kane, and why a man would flee from his own home leaving everything behind, remains locked away, known only to Mark, wherever he is. The final chapter of this story has yet to be written. Until then, the disappearance at Harper Road endures as Ashcroft's enduring enigma, a haunting reminder that sometimes the darkest secrets manage to slip through even the tightest locks, never to be seen again. Some mysteries leave behind footprints, others leave behind silence and a locked door swinging in the dark. And in the case of Mark Hansen, maybe the scariest part isn't what we know, it's what we never will. When the door finally closed, the truth slipped out with it. Every lock has a key, but some doors were never meant to open.
Every story has an end, but here, the mysteries never stop. Thank you for watching and being a part of this journey into the unknown. Your support keeps these stories alive, and there's plenty more waiting for you. We drop 3 new stories every week, so if you crave suspense, the unexplained and the downright chilling, make sure you're subscribed and ready for what's next. Until then, keep your lights on, your doors locked, and remember, some stories stay with you long after they're told.